Tim Mak, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Dialogue today. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me, why does someone decide to make a war zone their home and stay in Ukraine over these last 3.5 years?
Look, I mean, I didn't think about it that way exactly. For me, I was on assignment here for NPR in 2022, ended up arriving just the night the invasion happened. Um, Spent the whole first year in a very intense series of interviews and reporting and journalism, and realized I wasn't done with it. So I ended up leaving NPR and starting my own media company here called the Counteroffensive. And we've expanded. We're teaching Ukrainian journalists how to do human interest reporting to tell stories of the war. We're also doing really deep trade industry journalism into Ukrainian defense technology and innovation. So we've really tried to branch out and do all sorts of interesting reporting and journalism based out of Kyiv.
One of the things I know you're keeping an eye on is the talks going on, and there are different views of these talks. Some think it's the first, solid few steps towards a lasting peace in the country you're currently living in. Others have been calling it, Munich Agreement 2.0, looking back to what unfolded before the Second World War, Munich and Alaska. What do you see it as? Where do you fit, between those two poles?
Well, recently there's been two kind of major events in this kind of diplomatic, um, let's say, game. I mean, it's been this summit between Putin and Trump in Alaska, which is just patently outrageous, right? I mean, you think about what are the parallels? You've mentioned one in the era before World War II, but if we were trying to make an analogy now, it'd be like China and Japan getting together in Tokyo to discuss how they're going to carve up Hawaii. It's just having the subject of discussions not present is this kind of imperialist mindset in which diplomacy is conducted by great powers and other countries and peoples do not have the basic dignity of being involved in the discussion. That is, a pretty big problem. And then there's the question of whether any of these negotiations will actually amount to anything. Usually, diplomacy is very, very complicated. It's an art where you have two sides that have material differences in their interests and their desires, and you have a mediator in between that tries to bring these two sides a little bit closer together, halfway by incentives maybe, and halfway by enforcing some pressure. Um, in order to do that, you need to have someone that's pretty intelligent and creative and knowledgeable about both sides and what they want. We don't have that in this case. We don't have someone who understands the nuances of the relationship and the history between Ukraine and Russia, and it very much shows. It also shows that cannot be really a reliable mediator because he doesn't reliably convey information from one side to the other. I'll give you an example. Donald Trump has said that Vladimir Putin is okay with, security assurances by Western countries. We spent a lot of time over this past week talking about what Western European countries might do in order to provide these security guarantees. But as soon as they had that conversation, Russia publicly stated that they were not willing to allow Western countries to provide security guarantees and boots on the ground in Ukraine. So we just wasted an entire week talking about a concept based on Trump misinterpreting or misleading all the rest of us about the basis for what we should be discussing in a peace deal.
Tim, I
That's
don't
why I
think
think
have Putin and Zelensky ever met privately as leaders of their countries? There's talk of that now happening in Budapest. I think Zelensky wants it, in one of the Nordic countries. Have they ever met face to face? Have they ever looked each other in the eye?
they've met, I believe, in 2019, but only once, and prior to the full-scale invasion occurring. Zelensky's open to meeting with Putin. But for Putin, you imagine that there will be some real reluctance for a one-on-one because Putin has been saying that Zelensky is not a legitimate leader. He's been saying all sorts of outrageous stuff like, this is a Nazi regime and things like that. Um, so you can imagine that the Russians would be much less interested to seriously contemplate a one-on-one. I suspect that this meeting will not be forthcoming, it won't be soon. We have to look at actions, not what diplomats are saying. If we spent our time focused on flashy diplomatic summits rather than the actual actions of the parties involved in those summits, we might say, okay, well, there have been some interesting steps towards peace. But if we look at the actions of all the parties, you pointed out that Russia has continued to bomb
Mm.
and has continued to kill in Ukraine over the course of all this time that these so-called peace negotiations are underway. I mean, actions speak louder than words, and the Russians are not conveying any actions that suggest that they want peace.
What are Ukrainians' response to this? And we're now hearing all the realists come out and do podcast interviews, Mearsheimer, etc., saying that Ukraine needs to cut its losses, submit up a slice of territory, lest they lose even more territory or more men, more civilians on the battlefield. What are Ukrainians saying in the streets in response to that?
Mearsheimer is the kind of person who would say that Russia would never invade Ukraine in the first place, that sort of conflict doesn't exist in the 21st century. But he was wrong about that, and he's wrong about this. That he fundamentally misunderstands Ukraine and the Ukrainian attitude towards Russia, that they don't want to be ruled or controlled by Russia, and they seek much deeper integration with the West. The thing about this is that most Ukrainians understand that if some sort of ceasefire or a peace deal is made in the near term without strong security guarantees, it will simply be a prelude to the next invasion. And that's really the on the ground attitude here. I mean, you see a rising percentage of Ukrainians who want the war to end. But where the real issue exists is, where the real divergence occurs, is when you ask them, what are you willing to give up for that peace to occur? And that's where you have a lot less of a uniform response.
What
I
are they
think
willing to give
a
up?
lot of
Those who say that they are willing to give up something.
I think there's a tacit understanding in Ukraine that they're not going to be able to win all of their territory. But the idea that they would give up territory that they haven't already lost on the battlefield and just hand it over to Russia as part of a peace agreement, that's going to be very, very hard to stomach. You've got to realize that unlike Vladimir Putin, who runs a dictatorship, Zelensky is the president of a democratic society, and he'll be subject to elections likely very soon after any peace agreement is reached. And if he wants to maintain an office, he's not going to be able to sign a weak peace deal that looks like Ukraine is capitulating to Russia after all the sacrifices that millions of Ukrainians have made.
You heard this accusation come up again in the Oval Office. Those in the right in the U.S. saying that, throwing the dictator comments towards Zelensky, saying, "Why aren't you holding elections?" His response being, listen, in Ukraine, in the middle of a war, we are not able to hold safe elections, and also I can't remember. You can explain to me that our constitutional documents say as much. Have you heard this accusation made against him?
I've heard it being made mostly online by Twitter trolls.
Yeah.
But the Constitution of Ukraine does not permit elections during a period of martial law, which is obviously what we're seeing right now, a period of martial law, and a period of martial law that was instigated by Russia's invasion. Um, that being said, I suspect that Zelensky and those around him would be more than happy to have elections as soon as the war is sustainably ended. That being because right now Zelensky is still the most popular politician in Ukraine, and there are no obvious alternatives that would really be serious competition for him. So I don't think that the Zelensky camp is at all against the idea of holding elections as soon as it's possible. The thing that you hear from Ukrainians is that it's very difficult to hold elections, safe elections, during a period where bombings and drone attacks are occurring, that it's very hard to get ballots to soldiers who are on the front lines. And then there are, of course, the millions of Ukrainians that are currently refugees in Europe, in Canada, the United States, and many other places around the world who deserve some sort of say in their country's future, but it's very difficult to organize all of those things.
Let's talk about that fighting. I assume you've seen some of it, right? And you're a former U.S. Army medic. Can you explain to folks here in Canada what that looks like, what that experience is like to be there, and for these soldiers to be putting their lives on the line?
Well, it's become a very drone-heavy war early in the full-scale invasion, particularly when the lines were just beginning to form. Artillery was the king of battle. But right now, what you see is that 80% of battlefield casualties are being caused by drone attacks, things like FPV drones, these first-person kamikaze drones, first-person view kamikaze drones that blow up and are essentially guided artillery.
Really? So you're basically
It's
controlling it, and they're flying right into their target, whether that be people or some sort of military installation.
Exactly, yeah. There's been a lot of new technologies being developed in the realm of automation, in terms of electronic warfare, that's signals warfare, and then drone technology. It's changed the way that modern warfare is going to be conducted. And so, where previous wars relied a lot on mortars, artillery, to cause effects on target far away from your position. Now you can just get a drone into the air, put on these goggles, these first-person view goggles, and fly them 15, 20 kilometers away and use them as essentially a guided bomb.
Not only that, I'm there, you can see footage of this online. There's GoPros or the footage of munitions being dropped on people. You can actually view, which is pretty horrifying. I think you've described it's pretty asymmetrical, and we're entering a whole new battlefield. You say Ukraine could do more with less with its weaponry. What does that asymmetry look like? Like, how does the Russian and Ukrainian army compare to one another at this point? One is far larger than the other, but when you place them next to each other, what sort of features pop out to you in terms of differences?
Well, the Russian military may have numbers, and because of that, the Ukrainian military has needed to fight quantity with quality. It has the advantage, the Ukrainians do, of being on the defense rather than the offense, and it's used that advantage in order to develop really interesting, as we were talking about, drone technology that is able to hold the line and preserve their limited numbers in ways that the Russians have not excelled in. The Russians are losing more than 1,000 people a day in battlefield casualties because they view, and I think the evidence bears this out, they view their soldiers' lives as expendable. The Ukrainians are trying to use drone warfare in order to defend their positions because they want as much as possible to preserve the quality of their military leadership and their drone operators, which have become some of the most important resources of the entire military.
Another stat I've heard you pull out, this blew my mind. More Russians have died in the war in Ukraine than in the near decade that the Soviets spent fighting in Afghanistan in terms of lives lost there. Does that blow your
That's right.
mind as well? Is that surprising to you?
It blows my mind that that many people have died, but it also gives me a little bit of an indication of the domestic instability that is waiting for Vladimir Putin whenever it is that this war ends. You'll recall that the Soviet failures in Afghanistan played a substantial role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wonder if these battlefield losses are going to play a role in the downfall of Putin in the long term. There are enormous economic costs and demographic costs that have come with this war that aren't fully realized, and the effects of which have not really been allowed to mature and take place yet. We've seen real economic damage done by this war. Interest rates are nearly 20%, inflation in the double digits. And then there are, of course, the many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Whenever this war comes to an end, these thousands and thousands of soldiers that will go back to their villages and their towns and their cities in Russia with horrific trauma, with some missing limbs and some not returning home at all. That's going to have serious societal effects, and I don't think we've begun to see those yet.
You mentioned injuries. Have you provided any medical care to any soldiers while you've been over there the last few years?
I have not provided any medical care to any soldiers. No.
And this, we talk about the attacks. We see Ukraine going far into Russia, as far as Siberia, in terms of the recent drone attacks we talked about. And I'm interested in where you place this in your mind. Some see this as inventive last gasps of a military that just is eventually going to have to submit to a far larger force, but is showing what they can do with the technology you just described. Or are these signs of Ukraine, breaking through and getting the upper hand on the battlefield? Attacking the people that are attacking them, not being defensive, as you mentioned, but taking offensive moves. How should we think about those recent attacks that the Ukrainians have made?
Look, I think Ukraine's strategy takes into account and understands that due to their limited numbers, it's going to be very difficult to make huge, huge breakthroughs on the front lines. But one of the things they can do is make life very, very uncomfortable for Putin's regime. And one of the ways is to launch these long-range strikes into energy infrastructure in Russia, these oil refineries and things like that, in an attempt to raise energy prices and make Russians kind of feel the pain, the economic pain of the war that their government is currently engaged in.
Let's look at the Ukrainian home front. Ukrainians have been defending their territory for 3.5 years. Last time we spoke, you talked a lot about exhaustion, what it does to someone who's been not only defending physically, whether they're a soldier, but also having this in their mind, the fact that they're being invaded, what that does to your economy, what that does to your daily life. Can you describe to me what that exhaustion looks like for civilians in Ukraine on the home front?
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with, hey, can I get a good night's sleep at any point? And
Yeah.
the answer is that Putin's not going to permit it. That every night, or almost every night, you hear this whir um, of kamikaze drones, these Shaheds drones, flying in the dark, and it's ominous. You don't know which way you can't see them in the night sky. You don't know where they're going, and you don't know what they'll hit until you see explosions. You'll hear these booms of air defense and of explosions from incoming missiles, of anti-aircraft fire in the night. And all of that is enough. I mean, some people have enough anxiety getting to sleep under normal conditions, but add into that the fact that you got to sleep in your hallway or in a bathtub for some relative safety. And it adds up night after night after night after night, to say nothing of the pressures that might be put on you economically, to your employment, to your family life because of the war. And all those things are cumulative. And so it's not just a matter of acute stress, it's a matter of chronic stress that's now stretched out for 3.5 years. And that can have a real physical and mental toll.
You described to me at one point soldiers who are leaving the battlefield for a weekend, getting married, and then coming back on the battlefield because they're needed to fight. That's actually happening?
Yeah, absolutely. That's happening. Um, a lot of people are understanding just how short life can be, and wanting to exchange vows, or to take care of their loved ones, because there are, of course, payments made out to the family members of those who are killed on the battlefield. I mean, these are decisions that I hope no one who is listening to this will ever have to make. But these are kind of the dire real life consequences of understanding in a very, very specific way that life isn't infinite, and that our time is and can be extremely limited, and Ukrainian soldiers just get that viscerally.
At the same time, they're lighthearted about things. I guess you have to have a sense of sort of gallows humor. You've written in the Atlantic about what this looks like in comedy clubs, and I guess all the jokes are about Russians and about air raid sirens and about the missile attacks you described. That's kind of what humor looks like now in Kiev.
Well, humor always does have to have a sort of humor often has to include an element of political incorrectness, and humor, particularly with soldiers, involves pushing the bounds of what's acceptable. There are a lot of jokes about Russian air raids or about not wanting to go out on any particular night because they're worried about getting conscripted by the mobilization forces in Ukraine or whatever else. I mean, that's just the dark humor that people use in order to cope with a difficult situation.
And how does conscription look like? You mentioned conscription.
Yeah, conscription is struggling in Ukraine right now. I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, we're 3.5 years into the war. A lot of Ukraine's finest and most experienced soldiers have been either sidelined through injuries or killed. And so right now, it's a real struggle getting enough people to the front lines. That said, the Ukrainian military is set up in a way that the Canadian military is not, or the American military is not. And what they do is that if you sign up, you can choose your particular unit that you go to, which has led to a really interesting competition between various units to advertise, their skills, the training that they provide to the soldiers that decide to sign up, that they can specialize in drone technology or drone operation. Some units brag about how they give a greater amounts of training before sending people off onto operations than other units. And so there's all sorts of advertising campaigns happening across Ukrainian cities. You can see them on billboards, trying to one up one another in order to attract talent, kind of like IT companies. Trying to get the best programmers. You get the same vibe from these advertisements in Ukraine right now.
Interesting. I'd sent you a link or so about a day ago because I know you're initially from Canada, and I wanted to ask you about a controversy we had a year or so ago. There was a documentary put out called Russians at War. It was funded in part by the Canadian government, sparked a ton of criticism and controversy here in Canada. Its director, who has come out and said she's very anti-war, anti-Putin, Anastasia Trofimova, she filmed a Russian battalion, I think, for 7 months, she says, without Moscow's permission. Her attempt, this is what struck me here, was, I guess, somewhat similar to yours. You can tell me if I'm wrong, to try and showcase like the human side of war. She also revealed at the time how ill-equipped the Russian soldiers were, how many of them were misled about what they were fighting. Anyway, there was a ton of protests. Screenings were canceled at the Ontario Public Broadcaster, at the Toronto International Film Festival. They eventually had a showing, I think. I'm just wondering if you've seen that movie and whether you think people should watch that film and what it says potentially about the human side of war, or whether, this is something completely different and we should be wary about showing this side.
I guess the question is, who are the folks who deserve our empathy the most?
Hmm.
Are they Russian soldiers, many of whom, as her documentary shows, have joined the Russian military for financial purposes, or are they Ukrainians, the subject of the invasion? I know that one thing that the documentary, which by the way I have not seen, I know, but from what I have read about it, the documentary does not include any sorts of descriptions or condemnations of Russian war crimes that have occurred in occupied Ukrainian territory. Furthermore, the documentarian visited occupied territory, which is something that I think a lot of Ukrainians object to. Um, that said, I mean, we're looking at a deeper question, which is something that filmmakers, documentarians for a long time have debated, which is there really such a thing as an anti-war movie? Can you make it, or does the medium itself? Does the action and the explosions and the seeming sacrifice of the subjects on the screen essentially give a green light in some ways to the underlying conduct? If we're trying to humanize people, should we humanize the aggressor or should we humanize the victim? I, for one, want to understand the perspective of those who have been traumatized and attacked, and I want to spend a lot less time providing empathy to those doing the attacking. It's fine to understand the motivations of some of these people at war, but I think one of the big criticisms of this documentary was really, are they the most deserving subjects of our empathy? And then the kind of corollary question, which is, should the Canadian government have been involved in the funding of that film?
I guess that's the question. Yeah, can you hold empathy for, multiple sides at once? Putting aside those who went to war full well knowing the atrocities they may be causing, the invasion they were behind, versus those who were potentially misled, and putting your blame towards Putin and the authoritarian regime there as opposed to the people. But you're saying in some cases these are willing actors when it comes to Russian soldiers who are fighting this war. They know exactly what they're doing and they're responsible for their actions, right?
Well, I mean, let's try to pull a probably incomplete analogy, but if a documentarian embedded with Imperial Japanese forces made no mention of the Imperial Japan's war crimes and kind of zoomed in close to the sufferings of singular Japanese soldiers, we would wonder whether that empathy was well directed, whether, given the many, many subjects to cover in the world, whether this is a place where we ought to feel sorry for participants in that kind of military operation. I think that's where that's an incomplete analogy, obviously, but an analogy that gets closest to the question of, why should we watch this? Why should the government fund this?
Do you ever, given where you are, like obviously the Russians are the experts when it comes to misinformation propaganda. They created this invasion. There's obviously fog of war on both sides, though. Have you ever found, and do you come across, and how do you protect against spin from the Ukrainian side? Like, how do you sort of handle that, being the head of a media outlet in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, as journalists, it's our job to check facts and continue to ask questions, even inconvenient questions. So a sense of curiosity and a sense of skepticism should be our guiding principles. And those things haven't failed me yet in terms of ensuring that we do not veer into, despite our empathy and our for Ukrainians, that we don't become, folks that just absorb the messaging of the Ukrainian government or any government without questioning, without skepticism, and without important questions to hold people accountable.
Just lastly, Tim, this is a message you hear Westerners say a lot. I'm sure you'll hear it in Halifax, maybe a little bit when you come. These naysayers who aren't supportive of helping Ukrainians in their, the fight to defend their country, they'll say things like, "This war is going on a million miles away. I can't pronounce the names of the towns and cities on the map there. Yet I'm spending my tax dollars helping folks when we have problems here at home." How do you respond to those people and make them care?
I think fundamentally it's a question of whether we in the West have responsibilities to fellow democracies, whether we're better off with friends and what it means to be a good friend. I think that Canada and Ukraine have had long standing ties. One of the largest Ukrainian communities outside Ukraine exists in Canada, and there are many Canadians that have Ukrainian roots. But even if that were not so, I think the question is, how do we treat other countries in the world? Do we sit by and say nothing and do nothing when a democratic country is attacked by an authoritarian neighbor? And what happens the next time we're threatened in similar ways? Remember, of course, that Canada and Russia have had many sorts of diplomatic disagreements in the past, and in some ways we're neighbors to Russia. If we think of the Arctic as this area where these two countries might come together, this won't be the last time that Canada and Russia have disagreements. And I think I'd want to be on the side of Ukraine when it comes when that moment comes.
Yeah, I was just going to add that Putin was only steps away from this country only days ago, right, in Alaska. So these things are closer than they might seem initially. That's Tim Mak, founder of the Counteroffensive. Thank you very much for joining us today on Hub Dialogues. Let's remind our audience, where can they find your work?
They can find our work at www.counteroffensive.news. It's where we do human interest stories, going deep into the who of what's happening in this war.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. Be well, be safe.